Prisoners 849 escaping. Prisoners
470
escaping.
Multiple security breaches detected.
Prisoner 327 escaping. You have entered a restricted area. Prisoner 849 escaping. Prisoner
7-2.
escaping. Prisoner 327 escaping. You have entered a restricted area. You have entered a restricted area.
Andy.
助。時間有限，請到 coverc.com/Chinese 了解詳情。
Numbers move you, but some can stop you in your tracks, like the tens of thousands of people who were diagnosed.
Whether it's for extra lives in Contra, or to jump higher in Super Mario Bros., players use cheats to help them get through a game, or just to experience it in a whole new way. Cheating has been around almost as long as video games have. Early cheat codes were mostly used to assist developers and playtesters of a game. Soon, game designers were purposely adding them into games for players to discover. Most early cheats needed a passcode entered, such as the infamous Konami code. But there also exist cheat cartridges which would plug into a game console and modify the game's data. Several of these existed, but probably the most well-known device was the gimmicky. Of course, they wouldn't admit it was a cheat device. It was marketed and that players could unlock the power of their favorite device. But most kids, including myself, called it a cheat device. Anytime we got stuck on a game, we just fired up the Game Genie and it was smooth sailing from there. The Game Genie was developed by a UK-based company known as Codemasters. Back in the NES days, they were known for developing unlicensed games, like this Quattro Adventures. Originally known as the Power Pack, the Game Genie was licensed to Camerica for release in Canada, and Galoob Toys for the United States. It was at this time that Nintendo took legal action against both companies to prevent the device from being released in North America. We'll begin with Camerica. Camerica was a small Canadian video game company, mostly known for releasing Codemasters' unlicensed games. When they were preparing to release the Game Genie, Nintendo quickly sued, saying the device infringed on their copyright. The case was quickly dismissed in courts, and Camerica soon released the Game Genie in Canada. Thank you, Canada. Many eager gamers imported the device from Canada, while the release was delayed in the United States. Then there was Galoob Toys. Galoob produced some of the most popular toy lines in the 80s and 90s, including Pound Puppies and Micro Machines. At one point, they were the third largest toy company, behind Mattel and Hasbro. When Galoob secured the license to the Game Genie, Nintendo claimed it without getting it officially endorsed by them. Galoob denies that this happened. Nevertheless, Nintendo took legal action against Galoob. Howard Lincoln, Nintendo's vice president and legal expert, said, "It creates derivative works. It not only alters Nintendo games, infringing on copyright, but can make them less fun." Different. If you want to start at Chapter 11, you can. If the kid wants to start at World 8 because he's been through all the earlier levels before and doesn't want to spend an hour doing it again, why shouldn't he be able to? So what did the court decide? District Court Judge Fern Smith sided with Galoob in a decision that addressed two main issues. First, that when customers use the Game Genie to temporarily alter copyrighted Nintendo video games for their own enjoyment, they do not create a derivative work. For those wondering, a derivative work is an artistic or literary work derived from one or more existing works. An example would be if I took this lovely picture and drew googly eyes on it. Nintendo argued that the Game Genie was a derivative work. Court that it doesn't exist on its own in a separate form. But again, why should copyrighted Nintendo video games for their own enjoyment? They do not create a derivative work. For those wondering, a derivative work is an artistic or literary work derived from one or more existing works. An example would be if I took this lovely picture and drew googly eyes on it. Nintendo argued that the Game Genie was a derivative work and therefore violated the Copyright Act. The court disagreed. court concluded that the inherent concept of a derivative work is that it be able to exist on its own, in a separate form, but the Game Genie does not meet that definition. Second, that the doctrine of fair use enables consumers to use Game Genie for their personal enjoyment, and therefore allows the Game Genie to be sold. If a player purchased a Nintendo game, he was protected under fair use to modify the game for his own pleasure. Galoob emerged victorious and soon after released the Game Genie. Camerica, wanting to concentrate on other projects, and knowing Galoob was a much bigger company, sold their rights to Galoob. Most people, including myself, have the Galoob Game Genie, but if you have the Camerica version, congrats. They're a bit harder to find.
Now let's take a look at the Game Genie itself. It's pretty simple to use. You just plug the game you want to play into the cartridge here, and then plug the Game Genie into the Nintendo. When you power up the console, a code screen will appear. So, bust out your code book, or hop on the internet, and enter all the codes you want. So how did this thing work? Well, I'm no engineer or anything, but here's the easiest way I can explain it. Basically, the Game Genie interrupted communication between the chips inside the game and the chips inside the NES. Let's say you're playing Super Mario Bros. With an infinite lives code entered into the Game Genie. Imagine you die by running into this Goomba. The game chip will send a signal saying, this player has 2 lives left. The Game Genie will take that and modify it to say, this player has 3 lives left, then send the data on its way. Thus, you'll never run out of lives. A codebook came with every Game Genie, containing codes for various games. One interesting thing you could do was program your own codes. Galoob encouraged players to try it out by including a small guide in their codebooks. It's pretty cool because you can do all sorts of crazy things with your games. Game Genie codes only lasted as long as the system power was turned on, so if a code made your game look crazy, you could just turn the system off and on to try again. This book doesn't have every NES game, so how did Galoob provide codes for new games? Well, in the back of the code book, you could subscribe to Game Genie code updates. Every year, you'd get 4 new code books with the latest games. You know, reading this code book is like taking a trip back to the early 90s. Galoob wrote a little paragraph about each game that's in this code book, and it's fun to read what they said. Mega Man 3 says, check out the radical codes for the awesome Mega Man 3. Now, a lot of people have asked me if the Game Genie works on the NES too. Well, not out of the box. If you tried it, it would probably get stuck. Did Nintendo design the NES 2 in a way so that the Game Genie wouldn't fit? Well, maybe. Nevertheless, Galoob did design an adapter so that the Game Genie would fit safely into the NES 2. Now, if you thought the NES 2 was hard to find, this adapter is even harder. It was made in limited quantities at the end of the console's life.
Besides the original Game Genie, there were versions for the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Game Boy, and Game Gear. Sega made it an officially licensed product, probably to win over some gamers after Nintendo took Galoob to court. By 1997, the Super Nintendo was on the outs, and the Game Genie was officially discontinued. In 1998, Hasbro announced it was purchasing Galoob for $220 million. The Game Genie is important for several reasons. Galoob vs. Nintendo was an important case of intellectual property and what constituted fair use in the video game industry. The Game Genie also played a big part in making cheat devices more popular and user-friendly. Today you've got the Codebreaker, Action Replay, and Game Shark for various systems. That's all for this episode of The Game Historian. Thanks for watching.
The level of carbon dioxide in the air is rapidly increasing, and this increase is contributing to global warming, changing the world we live in. The good news is,
I've said previously on this show that my favorite video game console of all time is the Game Boy. I guess it holds a special place in my heart. It was the first video game system I could call my own, and I got it during my formative years. I absolutely loved being able to play games wherever I wanted, but that came with limitations. The screen wasn't backlit, and there were no colors, just 4 shades of gray under a green tint. It wasn't the prettiest screen to look at, and at night I had to find a light source to keep playing. But that was probably my only complaint about the Game Boy. But in 1994, my prayers were answered when Nintendo released the Super Game Boy. It was a device that plugged into your Super Nintendo and let you play your Game Boy games on your TV. In color. It took away the portability factor, but seeing some of my favorite Game Boy games blown up in color on TV was mind-blowing. But the Super Game Boy was so much more than that. It had a lot of cool options, and several games were designed to take advantage of them. So today on Gaming Historian, we're going to talk all about the Super Game Boy and its many features. Let's take a look.
The idea of playing Game Boy games on a home console wasn't a new idea, but it was new to the general public. During the NES era, Intelligent Systems, a developer partnered with Nintendo, designed a device known as the Wide Boy, which allowed you to play Game Boy games on the Famicom. Essentially, it was a Game Boy on a PCB attached to the Famicom Disk System RAM adapter. The controller was hardwired to the PCB and it used the console for power. It had some basic functions like changing the color scheme, but the Wide Boy was primarily used for development and media purposes, and was not sold in stores. There was also Nintendo's DemoVision, a big box that was able to output up to 2 Game Boys to composite video. It also added a Game Boy themed border around the video. Looks familiar, doesn't it? But, like the Wide Boy, it was primarily used for development purposes, as well as trade shows. If you've ever seen a Game Boy kiosk, they most likely contain a DemoVision inside. In June of 1991, Camerica, the same company that initially distributed the Game Genie, teased a new device that they were working on that allowed you to play Game Boy games on the NES, but Camerica never released it, possibly due to the threat of litigation from Nintendo. Finally, in June of 1994, Nintendo teamed up with video game hardware company Hori and released the Super Game Boy. It sold at a retail price of $59.99. By purchasing the accessory, Super Nintendo owners could get access to more than 350 Game Boy games. Nintendo also promised some new Game Boy games would be specifically designed for the Super Game Boy. It was a nice accessory for Nintendo. The Super Nintendo lacked backwards compatibility, and the Super Game Boy was a great way to bridge the gap between handheld gamers and console gamers. Initial thoughts were mixed. GamePro was particularly harsh, saying, "Who cares? This product adds little to the rapidly advancing technology of game systems." But for fans of the Game Boy, it was a way to finally play their favorite Game Boy games in color. The first release of the Super Game Boy came with only the device, but later releases, like the one shown here, came with a 72-page guidebook. It teaches you everything you need to know about the Super Game Boy, as well as provides basic walkthroughs of some of the more popular titles. It even included custom color palette codes. More on those in a minute. Let's open this thing up. Inside the Super Game Boy is, well, a Game Boy, minus the display and buttons, of course. Using the device is pretty self-explanatory. You plug in a Game Boy game to finally play their favorite Game Boy games in color. The first release of the Super Game Boy came with only the device, but later releases, like the one shown here, came with a 72-page guidebook. It teaches you everything you need to know about the Super Game Boy, as well as provides basic walkthroughs of some of the more popular titles. It even included custom color palette codes. More on those in a minute. Let's open this thing up. Inside the Super Game Boy is, well, a Game Boy, minus the display and buttons, of course. Using the device is pretty self-explanatory. You plug in a Game Boy game, insert the Super Game Boy into the Super Nintendo, and power it on. Pressing L and R on the controller at the same time opens the Options menu. Most people assume the Super Game Boy simply plays Game Boy games on your Super Nintendo. And yes, it does do that.
but it actually has quite a few more options as well. The first option is color palettes. While the box promises you can play your games in color, it should come with a disclaimer that it's only 4 colors. The original Game Boy displayed games using 4 shades of gray. The Super Game Boy simply adds color to each of those 4 shades. With older games, you can cycle through 32 preset palettes to find which one works best for you. The Super Game Boy also has a few predetermined palettes built in for a handful of older titles. Take tennis for example. Instead of defaulting to the first palette like most games, the Super Game Boy has chosen to use palette G on page 3, which is better suited for the game. There are some games specifically designed for the Super Game Boy that can display more colors, as well as change color palettes mid-game, but we'll get to that later. The next option is for borders. The Super Game Boy comes with 9 decorative borders to put around your game, since the Game Boy has a smaller resolution than the Super Nintendo. The default border resembles a Game Boy, but you can choose everything from an assortment of kitty cats, a movie theater, or a quaint little cabin in the woods. Some of these borders are smaller resolution than the Super Nintendo. The default border resembles a Game Boy, but you can choose everything from an assortment of kitty cats, a movie theater, or a quaint little cabin in the woods. Some of these borders have screensavers as well. If you go idle long enough or put in a cheat code, an animation will play, depending on the border you have selected. Then there's the controller options, which just lets you customize what the B button does on your controller. Speaking of controllers, did you know the Super Game Boy is also compatible with the Super Nintendo mouse? It can make things quite a bit easier when designing your own borders. In Japan, Hori released an official Super Game Boy controller, known as the SGB Commander. It featured a Game Boy design and had some shortcuts built in. You could change the speed of your game, mute the sound, and access the menu easily. By flipping the switch in the middle, you could even use it as a standard Super Nintendo or Super Famicom controller, although the L and R buttons are awkwardly placed. The next option is custom colors. In here you can actually make your own color palettes and save them via a password system. This is a pretty impressive feature and allows for a ton of different color combinations. The Super Game Boy Guide provides a few fun suggestions. The final option is called Graffiti, which lets you create your own border. Nintendo thought you could use this to take notes on a game or even draw on the screen to give yourself a new challenge. It's fun to mess around with, but unfortunately you can't save your creations. The Super Game Boy plays all the Game Boy games, but it can't play Game Boy Color exclusive games, like the Zelda Oracle series. It's also region-free, just like the Game Boy, so you can play Japanese and European releases. But then there were games specifically designed with enhancements for the device. On the label of those games, you'd see a Super Game Boy Game Pack logo. So what does this mean exactly? When you play a standard Game Boy game, you'll get a default color palette, and that's it. You can switch the colors around, but you have to do it manually. The game wasn't designed with the Super Game Boy in mind, so it can't take advantage. But with the Super Game Boy game packs, developers had a chance to take advantage. The best example of this is Donkey Kong, and for good reason. It was launched alongside the Super Game Boy to help promote sales and show off its capabilities. The first thing you'll notice is the colorful title screen in a detailed custom border that resembles an arcade machine. Now you're probably wondering, if the Game Boy can only show 4 colors, how is this title screen possible? Thanks to some clever programming, it's possible to assign different color palettes to specific areas on the screen, as little as 8x8 pixels. But there were limitations due to the Game Boy's power, so it was only possible on static areas of the screen. That means games had to be deliberately designed with this in mind, and you'll see it with Donkey Kong. World map stages also pop with color. The game also changes color palettes through stages automatically, something a normal Game Boy game can't do. There's even audio enhancements, such as when Pauline screams for help. Donkey Kong is the crowning achievement of Super Game Boy design. Most Super Game Boy game packs had simple additions, like a custom border. It wasn't worth the time and effort for developers to add these extra features, but there were a few notable exceptions. Pokémon Red and Blue also took advantage of color on static screens, bringing color to all 151 Pokémon during battles. Game & Watch Gallery contained several custom borders based on which game you selected. Wario Blast let you play with 2 players without the use of a link cable. You could even plug in a multi-tap for 4-player games. Space Invaders went a step further. If you played it on a Super Game Boy, it unlocked the Super Nintendo version of the game. A quirk that you may not really notice is the actual speed of the games. The Super Game Boy plays games 2.4% faster than the Game Boy. This is due to the clock speed of the Super Nintendo being slightly higher than the Game Boy. Again, it's not really noticeable unless you pay close attention. One downside is that there's no link cable support. Nintendo claimed adding 2-player support would, quote, interfere with the RF signal from the TV. It never became a big deal until the Pokémon craze in the late 90s, when everyone wanted to trade their Pokémon with each other. In response, Nintendo released the Super Game Boy 2 in 1998, in Japan only. It had a nice redesign with a sleek, transparent blue shell. However, there were minimal improvements. Nintendo added link cable support, so you could finally trade Pokémon or battle with a friend in Tetris. Heck, you can even hook up a Game Boy printer if you want. There's now 2 LED lights on the device, one for power and one for when the link cable mode is activated. They also added some new borders to use while playing. Nintendo also fixed the clock speed issue, so games play at their regular speed. Other than that, it's exactly like the original model. The Super Game Boy 2 was released to little fanfare. That same year, gamers were more excited for Nintendo's newest handheld, the Game Boy Color. Overall, the Super Game Boy was moderately successful. It's one of my favorite accessories from the 16-bit era, and they're pretty easy to find these days, going for around $10 to $15. Between both models, the Super Game Boy 2 is the superior version. It's a bit pricier, but that's because you'll have to import it. It does work on a North American console, but you'll need to tear the tabs out of your Super Nintendo cartridge slot to ensure it will fit. But if you thought playing Game Boy games on your TV ended here,
새로운 삶의 첫 발을 디딜 때
the early 90s console wars were a heated competition, pitting the Sega Genesis against the Super Nintendo. Ultimately, the Super Nintendo outsold the Genesis, but Sega didn't go down without a fight. They were always looking for a way to outshine Nintendo, and one way they did that was with the Power Base Converter. Released in 1989, the Power Base Converter is a Genesis accessory that allows you to play games from Sega's previous console, the Sega Master System. Pretty cool actually, and Sega touted backwards compatibility as one of the advantages to owning a Genesis over a Super Nintendo. That gave Sega some serious brownie points with parents. When the Super Nintendo was announced, some parents were angry that they had to buy a whole new system that couldn't even play any of their previous games.
I'm going to say no, and I'm going to explain to him how people market things to make you spend more money.
With the Power Base Converter, Sega didn't have this problem. For a relatively low cost, players could open up their Genesis to more than 80 Master System games. So let's take a look at this thing. As you can see by this Hills department store sticker, the Power Base Converter retailed for $35. To use the converter, you simply plug it into the top of a Genesis Model 1. The Genesis is essentially a beefed up Master System, but the cartridge slots are different. So the Power Base Converter is literally a converter. There's no additional plugs or wires required, which is nice. It also came with a mounting screw to secure it to the console, although I'm missing that piece. What about the Genesis Model 2 and Model 3? Do those work? The Model 2 does work, but you have to remove this back tab from the converter. If you don't, it blocks access to the AC adapter and AV input. The Model 3 doesn't work at all with it. The Power Base Converter accepts both cartridge and card-based Sega Master System games. However, there are some compatibility issues. According to the manual, these games only work if you use a Master System controller. Not a big deal if you're a collector. Grab a Master System controller and you're good to go, since it uses the same input as a Genesis controller. But back in the day, this might have been a problem. According to the first issue of Sega Visions magazine, Master System controllers weren't even sold in stores when the Power Base Converter came out. You had to buy them directly from Sega. Yikes. As far as I know, there's only one game that doesn't work with this thing, and that's F-16 Fighting Falcon.
Apparently, it uses a specific video setting designed for the Sega SG-1000, which the Master System can handle, but the Genesis cannot. On top of the power base converter, you'll notice this pause button. If you aren't familiar, the Master System controllers didn't have a pause button. It was located on the actual system. This replicates the original hardware. There's also a small cutout on the converter so you can still see the power light on the Genesis. The power base converter also came out in Japan and Europe. In fact, Europe got a second model that made it work out of the box with the Genesis Model 2. However, this version couldn't play the card-based games. When it was released in North America, the power-based converter didn't sell well. This was most likely due to the fact that the Master System itself didn't sell well. But Sega probably wasn't too concerned with the sales figures. The real reward of the power-based converter was that it was a great PR move in the fight against Nintendo. There's not much to the power-based converter, but it's a nice accessory. If you're going to pick one up, I'd make sure you have a Genesis Model 1. Overall, it's probably the best version of the Genesis anyway, and it's not worth modifying the converter to work on the Model 2. Due to the low sales numbers, the power-based converter is even more expensive today than when it originally came out. You can pick one up loose anywhere between $50 and $70. That's all for this episode of Gaming Historian. Thanks for watching.
Fight!
During the early 90s, Sega was the only company to truly challenge Nintendo for control of the video game market. The Genesis was the system responsible. Introduced to North America in 1989, it deeply cut into Nintendo's market share until it was discontinued in 1997. Now everyone is probably familiar with these two variations of the Sega Genesis. The Model 1 was the original. It was big and had funky stuff on it. High-definition graphics, a headphone jack, with volume control? Anywho, in 1993, Sega released the Genesis Model 2. It was lighter, had stereo sound, and is the most common version of the system. But in 1998, stores started selling this, the Genesis 3? What? The Genesis 3, model number MK1461, was released by Majesco under license from Sega. It shipped with a 6-button controller and retailed for about $50. Now, who exactly is Majesco? Well, they're a video game publisher, still around today actually, but back in the 90s their main focus was re-releasing games. Supposedly, the company would buy a surplus of games from the publisher, repackage them, print off a label, and sell it, all with permission from the original publisher, of course. Some notable Majesco re-releases include Castlevania 4, Sonic 3D Blast, and World of Illusion. One dead giveaway for a Majesco re-release is the packaging. They were always sold in a paper box, and the manual is in black and white. It should also say assembled in Mexico somewhere on the box. Chances are if you buy retro games, you probably have at least one Majesco re-release. Majesco is also responsible for the re-release of the Sega Game Gear in 2000. So back to the Genesis 3. Let's go over the system itself. First of all, it's tiny and weighs practically nothing, maybe even too light. Seriously, if you jerk your controller around at all, this thing might come flying off the shelf. The system also lacks an LED light, which is similar to two other redesigns I've already talked about. However, Majesco was nice enough to paint a bright orange color under the switch, letting you know when the system is turned on. The cartridge slot is also different. It's been modified so you can fit Japanese Mega Drive games into the system. As long as the game doesn't have region lockout, it'll play. No modifications or converters required. The system contains one composite out plug and a power plug, and the same cables you use on the Genesis 2 will work here as well. The Genesis 3 also had some internal fixes. In previous models, the Genesis had a bug in the memory controller of the system. This was fixed on the Model 3. However, some games actually utilized the bug. such as gargoyles, which means those games do not work on the Genesis 3. Now to go over some missing pieces. The Genesis 3 lacks an expansion port, so the Sega CD is incompatible. It also doesn't work with the Sega 32X, Power Base Converter, or Galoob's Game Genie. Any game that utilized an extra processor also won't work, such as Virtua Racing. Overall, the Sega Genesis 3 is a nice version of the 16-bit console, especially for import gamers or those wanting to save on some shelf space. However, some games simply don't work on the system, and any hardware add-ons, forget about it. This thing is simply just a Genesis. Today they're worth about $30 to $40, however, they are somewhat hard to find. The Jesco only sold the system for about a year, and by the end of the year they were selling them for as low as $19.99. Wow. So should you pick up a Genesis 3? Well, hopefully this video will help in your decision making. That's all for this episode of The Gaming Historian. Thanks for watching.
Enjoy the ride, my dude.
On October 22, 1989, Nick Tiemann took his son, Clark, to a Child World toy store in Westport, Connecticut. For the past few years, Clark had been saving money by collecting soda cans and bottles at a nearby athletic field. Now he was finally ready to cash in and buy a new game for his Nintendo Entertainment System. After browsing the titles, Clark settled on a sports game, LJN's Major League Baseball, with a retail price of $39.99. As soon as they got home, Clark ripped off the shrink wrap and popped in the game to play. LJN's Major League Baseball was the first game on the NES to have an official MLB license, meaning the game could use MLB team names and logos. However, it did not have a license from the MLB Players Association, which meant no player names were in the game. Instead, players were represented by stats and uniform numbers. That didn't sit well with Clark. Where were all of his favorite players? And how come the rosters weren't up to date? Upset, he went to his dad. "This isn't what I thought it was," Clark said. "We'll take it back," replied his dad. Nick and Clark headed back to Child World, hoping to return the game, but the store refused. Once the shrink wrap had been broken, the store couldn't give a refund. Nick and Clark could only exchange the game for a new copy, and only if theirs was defective. Nick Tiemann decided to contact Nintendo of America, claiming that the game was misrepresented. Unless you know all the numbers of the baseball players, you don't know who anyone is. If I'm a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old and I'm buying the game right now, I'd like to have Ricky Henderson on my team. In this game, he is a Yankee, he said. But Nintendo of America ignored him. At that point, Nick, a lawyer, decided to take matters into his own. own hands. On January 16, 1990, Nick and Clark Tiemann sued Nintendo of America, LJN, and Major League Baseball. The Tiemanns claimed that the game's packaging violated the Connecticut Unfair Trade Practices Act, which prohibited unfair and deceptive acts and practices in trade and commerce. They filed the suit as a class action, which would allow others who purchased LJN's Major League Baseball to join in. The Tiemanns hoped to prevent Nintendo and LJN from selling the game as it was packaged, or force them to sell it with new packaging that was less deceptive. In addition, they wanted punitive damages, attorney fees, and finally, a $40 refund on their purchase. The press jumped all over the story. Some found the situation amusing. Jim Taylor of the Province newspaper in Vancouver wrote, "When you were 9 years old, how hard would your parents have laughed, or possibly smacked your butt, if you'd asked them to line up an appointment with a lawyer?" After several delays, lawyers for Nintendo of America filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit on April 4, 1990. The reason? A failure to state a cause of action. In other words, Nintendo was saying, so what? Even if everything the Tiemanns stated was true, they had no legal recourse. LJN's Major League Baseball was released in April of 1988 and developed in 1987, 2 years prior to Clark's purchase. The rosters were accurate at the time of development. The game also never claimed to have player names, just said each team was, quote, represented with its own full roster. Clark Tiemann felt otherwise. The game promised that players could simulate being a manager, but without player names, Clark couldn't choose who to put on the field. His attorney, Lawrence Kanaga, stated, Tiemann discovered it contained insufficient data to allow him to make the managerial decisions it promised. In the U.S. District Court in New Haven, Connecticut, both sides argued their case, and on December 28, 1990, Judge Ellen Burns made her decision. Case dismissed. It was a victory for Nintendo. The Tiemanns appealed, but their appeal was eventually withdrawn. As for LJN's Major League Baseball, despite its lack of player names and multiple glitches, the game sold more than 1 million copies. Was LJN guilty of false advertising on their game? According to the law, no. But it wouldn't be the only time one of their products had questionable marketing. The web series Angry Video Game Nerd pointed out a problem on the LJN video art box.
And just to add insult to injury, on the box, the panda is colored in perfectly. How can you market it as a coloring program when there isn't even a way to color anything in?
Nintendo of America wouldn't be strangers to further lawsuits from children. In 1991, a teenager claimed the NES gave her carpal tunnel syndrome. Another claimed the game Kid Icarus caused an epileptic seizure. Although the case never went anywhere, it's always interesting to see a consumer, especially a 9-year-old, fight back. That's all for this episode of The Gaming Historian. Thanks for watching.
Funding for Gaming Historian is provided in part by supporters on Patreon. Thank you.
This episode of The Gaming Historian is sponsored by Audible. Stay tuned till the end of the video for more information. Siskel and Ebert called it one of the worst films of 1993. It cost $48 million to make and grossed just under $21 million. It was over budget and behind schedule. The Super Mario Bros. Movie was the first major motion picture based on a video game. game franchise was a huge success. It made sense to bring that magic to the big screen. But by most accounts, it was a disaster from start to finish. In recent years, several actors who worked on the film called the experience a nightmare. There was on-set drinking, constant script rewrites, and a pair of directors who were openly disliked. Sometimes the story behind a movie is better than the movie itself, and that's definitely the case with the Super Mario Bros. Movie. Let's take a look. The Super Mario Bros. Movie seemed like a safe bet. After 3 successful games on the Nintendo Entertainment System, as well as a highly anticipated release on the Super Nintendo, the franchise was a critical and commercial hit. Mario was one of the most recognizable video game characters of all time. The success carried over to merchandise, cereal, and a cartoon series. There was even a movie, but it wasn't live action. Super Mario Bros. The Great Mission to Rescue Princess Peach was a Japanese animated film released in 1986. It was one of the first movies based on a video game, but it never saw release outside of Japan. A major motion picture seemed like the next logical step. Hollywood's biggest producers saw an opportunity in Super Mario Bros. And were willing to pay up. Offers poured into Nintendo in the $5 to $10 million range. But for Nintendo, it wasn't about the money. They didn't need it. Critics panned Nintendo's first foray into movies, the 1989 film The Wizard, for being a 96-minute Nintendo commercial. This time around, they wanted to find the best fit, hoping to not repeat past mistakes. In the fall of 1990, Nintendo shocked just about everyone when they gave away the movie rights for just $2 million. And who they sold it to was even more surprising. A small production company known as Leitmotiv, led by independent filmmakers Jake Eberts and Roland Joffe. Although the pair wasn't exactly known for making family-friendly films, their resume was impressive. They were best known for the 1984 film The Killing Fields, about the genocide of 2 million people in Cambodia. The film won 3 Oscars and was nominated for 7. Eberts and Joffe saw potential in Super Mario Bros., not as a way to show off their creativity and bring their vision of the Mushroom Kingdom to life, but as a way to bring in cash to their small studio and become full-time producers. During the pitch to Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi, Joffe imagined a prequel story with an edge, one that would appeal to adults as well as kids. He sweetened the deal by offering something the bigger movie studios wouldn't: some creative control, and all the merchandising rights. Nintendo saw the whole idea as little more than an experiment. In their eyes, the Mario franchise was too big to fail. Yamauchi also liked Joffe's vision of a gritty film. It seemed like a win-win. Nintendo could be in the loop, and Eberts and Joffe would get the movie rights at a huge discount. What could go wrong? With input from Nintendo, Eberts and Joffe got to work assembling a team. The most important question being, who would play Mario? It seemed as though fortune was on their side when Dustin Hoffman expressed interest in the lead role. He just won his 2nd Academy Award and had a great reputation for his roles in The Graduate, Rain Man, and All the President's Men. Joffe was ecstatic when he heard the news, but Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa wasn't. He didn't think Hoffman was the right man for the job, so they turned him down. Their next choice was Danny DeVito, whose star was rising after successful roles in Twins and War of the Roses. He was also the actor who most closely resembled Mario. However, DeVito wanted to read the script before signing on, and he eventually turned it down. Following that rejection, Leitmotiv reached out to Tom Hanks, and he actually agreed to play Mario. He was set to take the role for $5 million, but before he signed the contract, Nintendo and the producers got cold feet. At the time, Tom Hanks was in a bit of a slump. The Burbs in 1989 and Joe vs. the Volcano in 1990 received mixed reviews, and The Bonfire of the Vanities, which also came out in 1990, was just bad. Entertainment Weekly called it one of the most indecently bad movies of the year. So for a very short time, Tom Hanks' stock was down. Nintendo and the producers worried that Tom Hanks wasn't worth $5 million and didn't have the it factor to carry a dramatic movie. Tom Hanks had already starred in huge movies like Splash, Big, and Turner and Hooch. He even received an Academy Award nomination for his starring role in Big. But until that point, he was really only known for his comedic roles. They wanted the Super Mario Bros. Movie to be dark and gritty. They worried that Tom Hanks couldn't handle it. So, before Hanks could sign anything, Nintendo and the producers pulled the offer. They discovered their error pretty quickly. In 1993, the same year that the Super Mario Bros. Movie debuted at the box office, Tom Hanks starred in the groundbreaking film Philadelphia. He received an Oscar for his performance as a closeted gay man who eventually dies of AIDS. After rejecting Dustin Hoffman and Tom Hanks, and getting rejected by Danny DeVito, Leitmotiv finally found the man for the job, British actor Bob Hoskins. They were impressed by his range. He'd received an Oscar nomination for his dramatic role in the 1986 film Mona Lisa, and was fresh off a successful leading role in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Bob Hoskins accepted the role primarily for the money, but he also thought the initial script was good. He didn't even know the Super Mario Bros. Movie was based on a video game until after he accepted the role. His son filled him in. Soon after Bob Hoskins signed on, John Leguizamo took the role of Luigi. At the time, Leguizamo was so sure the Super Mario Bros. Movie would be a success that when a major TV network offered to develop a sitcom about his life, he turned them down. He thought he was too good for TV. For the role of Koopa, the producers needed a steely villain. Arnold Schwarzenegger and Michael Keaton were both offered the part, but they declined. Ultimately, Dennis Hopper, whose lengthy acting career included parts in Apocalypse Now and Hoosiers, landed the role. Samantha Mathis, who went on to appear in American Psycho and The Punisher, played Princess Daisy. But if there's one thing more important than getting the right actors, it's getting the right directors and writers. And that's where the Super Mario Bros. Movie went spiraling out of control. After Nintendo and Leitmotiv struck their movie deal, Roland Joffe hired Greg Beeman as director. Beeman was still a relatively new director. He had just one film under his belt, the 1988 comedy License to Drive, starring Corey Haim and Corey Feldman. Meanwhile, Barry Morrow, who had just won an Oscar for the screenplay to Rain Man, worked on the script. Morrow played Super Mario Bros. For a day, and afterward crafted a mythical story that revolved around a complex relationship between two brothers. But the story was too dark and too similar to Rain Man. Morrow didn't appreciate the feedback. He dropped out and passed writing duties off to two newcomers, Jim Genuine and Tom S. Parker. The pair were up and coming in the world of Hollywood writing. They had just sold a script that would become the 1992 movie Stay Tuned for $750,000 and were looking for more work. In their script, the Lizard King Koopa kidnaps Luigi's love interest, Hildy, so he can gain access to the Crown of Invincibility. Mario, Luigi, and their sidekick Toad set off to rescue her. It was a simple fantasy plot, and it closely resembled the actual games. The script contained references to Goombas, Thwomps, Bob-ombs, Chain Chomps, and even the Hammer Brothers. Meanwhile, Leitmotiv Studios sought funding for the film. However, distributors were hesitant to pay up with newbie Greg Beeman as director. Roland Joffe let him go, saying Beeman, quote, didn't have the stretch for it. Joffe sought out a new director, and he eventually settled on a husband and wife duo, Annabelle Jankel and Rocky Morton. Jankel and Morton didn't have a ton of big screen experience. They'd only directed one movie, a 1988 thriller called DOA. It starred Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan and received mixed reviews. But the couple had a fresh, innovative style, and their work was impressive. They directed music videos for Elvis Costello, Miles Davis, and the Talking Heads, and they'd done some major commercials. But what really set them apart was Max Headroom, 20 Minutes into the Future, a TV movie that ran on Channel 4 in the UK. The futuristic show featured an actor made to look like a computer-generated TV host. Max Headroom was weird and edgy. It had a very defiant, early MTV vibe. They created Max Headroom along with screenwriter George Stone and directed the TV movie together. The idea eventually became a TV show in the UK and the United States. Their style seemed like a good match for the producer's vision of a darker, more adult-skewed Mario movie. When Jankel and Morton read Genuine and Parker's fairy tale script, they hated it, but they saw potential in a Super Mario Bros. Movie. Morton turned to Jankel and said, "This script is terrible, but I think this could be our Batman." To bring their vision to life, Jankel and Morton hired Chicago-based writers Parker Bennett and Terry Runt, whose only claim to fame was the odd dark comedy Mystery Date, starring Ethan Hawke. Bennett and Runt kept the same basic plot from the fairy tale script, but gave it a sci-fi twist. Nintendo was somewhat concerned about the direction the movie was heading, but to their surprise, they actually enjoyed the new script. It looked as if all the puzzle pieces had been found. That is, until directors Annabelle Jankel and Rocky Morton stepped in. Even with the sci-fi element, the directors felt the new script was too boring. They thought it needed pumping up. The pair wanted to create a parallel universe where dinosaurs survived and evolved. The dinosaur land, called Dino Hatton, would be ruled by the evil King Koopa. Mario and Luigi would access the universe via a portal in the New York sewer system. With that direction, Bennett and Runt took another crack at the script. Their second version included the Dino Hatton element, plus a Mario character that closely resembled the mix of humor and sleaze that Bill Murray brought to his role in Ghostbusters. But once Bob Hoskins signed on, the character was reworked to be older and more appealing. Bennett and Runt worked quickly to revise the script, but they didn't work fast enough for those in charge. Bennett and Runt were fired. The directors replaced them with Dick Clement and Ian LaFrenne. Together they created a more action-heavy script. It was so action-packed that the initial script even called for a Bruce Willis cameo, but Nintendo and the producers thought that version was a little over the top, so the writers toned it down. Everyone was happy. For about a minute. Distributors thought the script was too dark. Then the producers got cold feet. They worried that the script, which at this point all the actors had signed on for and the directors approved of, strayed too far from the video games. To solve this, the producers hired new writers to revise the script even further, but with one condition. The directors were forbidden to work with the writers. To the producers, it seemed like the only way to save the script from overbearing directors. But to the directors, it was a slap in the face. Writers Ed Solomon, known for his work on the Bill and Ted movies, and Ryan Rowe were called in to doctor the existing script. They added more Disney-friendly elements, like a wedding for Mario and his girlfriend Daniela. They also lightened up some of the more serious scenes and toned down some budget-busting ideas. When Jankel and Morton saw the revised script, they almost walked out, but they had already come so far. The set was complete, designed by David Snyder, who is known for his work on Blade Runner. All of the actors were on board. The project even had solid financing. Disney's Hollywood Pictures agreed to back the film. The directors felt they had no choice. Jankel and Morton stuck around, hoping to steer the movie while filming to match their vision. In the summer of 1992, production started in an abandoned cement factory in Castlehane, North Carolina, just outside of Wilmington. It was time to film the Super Mario Bros. Movie. When the actors arrived on set the following week and received their new scripts, they were stunned. It was completely different than the script they were pitched. They expressed their displeasure to the producers, who incredibly brought Parker Bennett and Terry Runt back out to help revise the script yet again, as well as consult on set. It was a frustrating process, made even worse by a lack of communication between directors, producers, and actors. The sweltering heat didn't help either, as temperatures shot above 90 degrees in the humid North Carolina summer. But the cast and crew did have one thing uniting them: a common enemy, directors Rocky Morton and Annabelle Jankel. In early August of 1992, with production underway, freelance journalist Richard Staten captured the on-set turmoil in an article for the Los Angeles Times. He wrote that the cast and crew were so unhappy with the directors that they'd begun mocking the couple. They gave them nicknames. Rockabelle, a combination of their first names, was the most flattering. They also called them Rocky and Annabelle, the Flying Squirrel Show, and Hydra. British actor Bob Hoskins summed them up in perhaps the least flattering way when he told John Leguizamo, "Not all English people are like them. He's a and she's a cow." He would later say that Rocky and Annabelle's arrogance had been mistaken for talent.
Bob Hoskins wasn't the only one who was frustrated, and he definitely wasn't the only one to talk openly about it. Dennis Hopper said that Rocky Morton and Annabelle Jankel were, quote, control freaks and wouldn't talk to each other before they made decisions. The directors contradicted one another on a regular basis, which made it harder for people to perform their jobs. But no behind-the-scenes anecdote illustrates the on-set atmosphere quite as well as a now infamous story about Rocky Morton, an extra, and a cup of hot coffee. According to John Leguizamo, Morton was looking at the extras on set and was not happy with what he saw. He thought the costumes looked too pristine. He grabbed a coffee and poured it all over one of the extras. The actor was wearing a rubber mask, but it wasn't sealed at the neck, so the hot coffee seeped through the suit and burned him. The man screamed. Morton said, "Oh well, he's just an extra," and shrugged. Morton has since argued against Leguizamo's version of this story. He says that Leguizamo was too far away to see what really happened. According to Morton, he thought the costumes needed to be more dirty, so he picked up some mud from the set and chucked it onto an extra's costume, but it didn't stick. He thought some coffee would help make mud stick to the costume, so he picked up a cup that had been sitting around for a while and said to the extra, "I'm going to pour this on you to stick the mud on. Is that okay?" When he poured it on, the man screamed. Morton says he apologized and got cool water for the man's shoulder. At some point, maybe after this incident, the crew made t-shirts with all of the rude or dismissive comments that the directors made, and they didn't keep them tucked away in a closet. They actually wore them on set. The constant script rewrites made matters even worse. The script changed so much every day that the actors didn't see the point in reading the new copies. Dennis Hopper said, "The script had probably been rewritten 5 or 6 times by the time I arrived here. I don't really bother with it anymore. I just go in and do it scene by scene. I figure it's not going to hurt my character." Bob Hoskins had pretty much the same approach. He said, "All these rewrites get frustrating, so I don't do too much research." One scene originally called for strippers, which the crew hired locally in Wilmington, North Carolina. But when the producers got wind of this, they quickly changed the scene to dancing at a nightclub. The actors and the rest of the crew learned to take it one day at a time and to accept that the newest script would be a lot different than the one they signed up for, but it was a bitter pill to swallow. Fiona Shaw, who played Lena, was increasingly disenchanted. When she heard rumors of a scene where she and Dennis Hopper would sit in a mud bath filled with $3,000 worth of worms, she was disgusted. She said, "The first script I got was witty. That was maybe 10 scripts ago. Now they're talking about taking a bath with worms." But, as Leguizamo would later say, the worse the movie, the better the partying. The crew partied through their misery. Leguizamo and Hoskins actually did shots of scotch between shoots. One day, Leguizamo and Hoskins were drinking scotch when they were called in to shoot a stunt scene. The scene called for Luigi to drive the Mario Brothers van. Hoskins didn't show any signs that he'd been drinking, but Leguizamo definitely did. In the scene, Leguizamo accelerated just as Hoskins shouted his line, "Come on, Luigi, Koopa's getting away." So Leguizamo slammed on the gas, then quickly slammed on the brake. The van almost tipped over. When Hoskins grabbed the door frame, the sliding door shut on his hand. Hard. Hoskins unleashed a long line of profanities. Leguizamo remembered it as, quote, "a kind of Cockney Tourette's." For the rest of production, Hoskins wore a cast, which they painted a pale pink color to match his skin. But it wasn't all bad. Leguizamo and Samantha Mathis started quickly slammed on the brake. The van almost tipped over. When Hoskins grabbed the door frame, the sliding door shut on his hand. Hard. Hoskins unleashed a long line of profanities. Leguizamo remembered it as, quote, "a kind of Cockney Tourette's." For the rest of production, Hoskins wore a cast, which they painted a pale pink color to match his skin. But it wasn't all bad. Leguizamo and Samantha Mathis started dating while they filmed the movie. In his book, Leguizamo says that meeting Samantha was just about the only good thing to come of the movie. The making of the Super Mario Bros. Movie was a dramatic mess, but it would be unfair to pin all the blame on the directors. Jankel and Morton were pioneering something that hadn't been done on a large scale, and it was a pretty challenging task.
Their music videos and TV show were good, but it was a big leap to go from that to directing a $48 million, first-of-its-kind, big-budget video game movie. On top of that, they weren't really allowed to do what they did best. The producers hired Jankel and Morton because the pair had a gritty, futuristic style. They were edgy and different. But when it came time to actually make the movie, the producers, the studio, and Nintendo got nervous. They pulled back. They wanted to make the movie more comedic, family-friendly, and a little less weird. And what they got was something in between. Morton called the project a harrowing experience. The script that he and Jankel wanted was more sophisticated than the final product, and that in the version they fought for, the bond between the two brothers was a much bigger, more emotional part of the story. But when the studio wanted something different, Jankel and Morton felt they had little choice but to go along. It was tough. He said, "I had to stand by with the new script, obviously, and tell them that it was great, when I knew it wasn't." It was tough from a technical standpoint too. They had a huge set, but not enough money to properly light it, and with the script constantly changing, continuity was nearly impossible. After a grueling 15 weeks in production, it was time to edit the film. But to Morton's surprise, the directors were locked out of the editing room, forbidden to intervene. They had to get help from the Directors Guild of America just to get in the room. Through all the drama, somehow, a movie was filmed and edited. Nintendo knew the final product wouldn't be good, but they were still confident it would make a lot of money, thanks to the Mario brand. They were in for a rude awakening. The Super Mario Bros. Movie hit the box office in May of 1993. It bombed. Fans of the franchise were confused. They thought they'd be watching a movie that was bright and fun, an action-packed, family-friendly adventure. But the movie strayed pretty far from the beloved video games that inspired it. They got an entirely different plot. When a meteorite hit Earth 65 million years ago, it created a drab, parallel dimension where dinosaurs survived. Over time, the dinosaurs evolved into humanoids. King Koopa rules the humanoids, but he wants to merge the two dimensions so that he can rule humans and humanoids. But the only way to do that is by using a meteorite fragment, which Princess Daisy wears around her neck. When Koopa's henchmen Iggy and Spike kidnap Daisy, Mario and Luigi set out to save her. The two plumbers enter an underground portal where they are transported from Manhattan to Dino-Hattan, where they aim to save the princess and defeat King Koopa. Along the way, there are some weirdly adult scenes, some unsuccessful attempts at humor, and most of the time, it feels like the constant action sequences are just meant to distract from the fact that there isn't much of a plot. There are, however, some nods to the games. There are Bob-ombs, Goombas, Yoshi, and Bullet Bills. The woman in the nightclub is named Big Bertha, a reference to the fish enemy from Mario 3. There's even a character named Toad. Mario and Luigi are plumbers, though they may have hit that reference home a little too hard. And they eventually do wear their iconic red and green overalls. But none of that was enough to satisfy fans of the franchise, and the story wasn't strong enough to draw in people who weren't hooked on the games. In trying to appeal to everyone, the movie appealed to no one, and the critics took notice.
A popular video game, it's called Super Mario Bros., and it doesn't work at all. This movie isn't either high or low tech enough. It's not as dazzling or as involving as the cutting-edge video games that would like to mirror, and it doesn't have the traditional movie elements like compelling characters or a fresh story. I also can't figure out exactly what age group this movie was made for.
You look at the movie and you see millions of dollars on the screen of special effects and all of those customized cars and that other world that they've created and everything else, and it doesn't add up to anything. It's just a lot of people running around, all talking at once, in a plot that nobody cares anything about, and just every once in a while, a little moment that kind of sparkles. Dennis Hopper is kind of good in a couple of his speeches, but it's a complete waste of time and money.
But the reviews weren't all bad. Quite a few praised the talented cast and the fact that the movie is visually stunning, but such compliments were usually brought back down to earth pretty quickly. In a mostly positive review, Janet Maslin of the New York Times noted that the plot turns barely comprehensible in its last half hour. The movie grossed just under $21 million on a $48 million budget. Just a few weeks after Super Mario Bros. Hit the box office, another dinosaur-filled movie made its debut, to much greater success. Over time, the Super Mario Bros. Movie developed a reputation as being notoriously bad. Even decades after it debuted, the key cast and crew couldn't shake it. Annabelle Jankel and Rocky Morton haven't directed a movie since. After the in-depth LA Times article about the on-set turmoil, Jankel and Morton were dropped by their agent. The scripts stopped coming. They couldn't get meetings, and the phone stopped ringing. Said Morton, "Nobody wanted to touch us. We were like lepers in Hollywood. Still to this day, I have projects and I call up the managers and agents to try and represent it, and they say, 'You did Super Mario Brothers?' Oh God. It was like 20 years ago, but it's still there." But the directors weren't the only ones who were haunted by this movie. In a Q&A with The Guardian, Bob Hoskins was characteristically blunt. "What is the worst job you've done?" Super Mario Brothers. "What has been your biggest disappointment?" Super Mario Brothers. "If you could edit your past, what would you change?" "I wouldn't do Super Mario Brothers." Dennis Hopper felt the same way. By the end of his life, he'd spent 5 decades in the business and appeared in more than 100 movies. When Conan O'Brien asked him if he regretted being in any of them, Hopper didn't hesitate. He said, "I made a picture called Super Mario Brothers. My 6-year-old son at the time, he's now 18, he said, 'Dad, I think you're probably a pretty good actor, but why did you play that terrible guy King Koopa in Super Mario Brothers?' I said, 'Well, Henry, I did that so you could have shoes.' And he said, 'Dad, I don't need shoes that badly.'" It may seem like everybody hates this movie, and to be fair, most people do. But a funny thing has happened over the past few years. Super Mario Bros. Movie has developed a cult following. In 2014, it was released on Blu-ray in the United Kingdom. Websites like the Super Mario Bros. Movie Archive, which Ryan Haas started in 2007, deserve part of the credit for this shift in public opinion. The site is home to cast interviews, photos, and even contains some of the early draft scripts. Over time, Haas says he has seen the conversation about the movie evolve. People are more willing to reevaluate their initial thoughts on the movie. Through his interviews with the cast and crew, he sees that nowadays, a lot of people look back on the film and appreciate that what they were doing was unprecedented. For a while, it seemed like the Super Mario Bros. Movie would be the first and last big-budget video game movie. But over time, we've seen a few video game adaptations hit the big screen. But most have been panned by critics, and their financial success varies significantly. Some say that the Super Mario Bros. Movie had a chilling effect on video game movie adaptations. But things are starting to change. In May of 2016, 23 years after the Super Mario Bros. Movie flopped, Nintendo announced that it was finally breaking back into the movie business. So what does this mean for the future? Well, it's hard to tell. If they can make a major hit, then Nintendo could pave the way for a slew of video game movie adaptations. But if the project bombs, then nothing will have changed. That's all for this episode of Gaming Historian. Thanks for watching.
Funding for Gaming Historian is provided in part by supporters on Patreon. Thank you.
Out in the woods, it's common to hear a branch or twig snapping. But if you're very unlucky, it may just be the limbs of a werewolf snapping as it transforms into an abomination ready to tear any campers apart. Today's stories are about werewolves and dogmen allegedly actually seen in the woods. So scrounge up any silver you have and be ready for a fight. These are werewolf and dogmen seen in the woods. If you have a scary story and want it narrated, share it with us at darkstories.org. If you want to listen to stories like these while you work, drive, jog, or sleep, search for and follow the Darkness Prevails podcast on Spotify and iTunes. And if you got a moment, please leave us a review on iTunes too. Thank you. Now, let's begin. Warning. The following story contains a depiction of half-eaten animals. Vomiter. From Anonymous. When I was a kid, I loved exploring the woods and picking mushrooms. My dad taught me which kinds were edible and which weren't. And my mom really knew how to cook them up, if I got the right kinds. We lived in the Midwest, where autumns could get really cold. And midway into October, there would be an ocean of leaves in every direction. Autumn was my favorite season. To me, the temperature was perfect, and the scenery was at its most beautiful. So it's no wonder that I would explore the woods more often during the fall months. My mom and dad were fine with that, as long as I came home before sunrise. This particular experience taught me why getting home before it's dark is always the best idea. Let's just say, if you stay after dark, you might see something you regret. This happened in 1983, so I would have been 10 years old. I went walking through the wooded trails a few hours before sundown. I soon found myself distracted. I was excited at the amount of mushrooms I was finding, and I really regretted not going home to get the basket I often used. Instead, I was sticking as many in my shirt as I possibly could. When I had as much as I could carry, I started to head back home, but it only took a few seconds for me to realize I'd gotten myself lost. I may have grown up around these woods, I may have been exploring them for years, but even experienced hikers can find themselves lost for good in the wilderness. The thought of that really scared me. It was something my dad had always reminded me of. You see, he took pride in how much I liked being outdoors. He did everything he could to teach me to be independent, yet safe out here. Even so, the worst had happened. I no longer recognized where I was, and I had no clue what direction the trail lay. I remember being told to not panic in this kind of situation, as you'll likely end up getting more lost than you originally were. So I stood there for a while, studying my surroundings, hoping that something would ring familiar in my head, then it would all come together at once. But that wasn't happening. I then racked my brain to remember what else my dad had taught me. If you're lost, son, stay put. We'll come find you. That's right. It couldn't have been more than a mile in, I knew that. And I knew that if I tried to find my way back to the path in a panic, I could end up a number of miles away from my home. Finding a wide and ancient sassafras tree nearby, I sat with my back against it, scattering the mushrooms in the ground beside me neatly. I was confident that my dad would find me. They knew what trails I went on, and they would know to search near those trails. I wanted to call out, but my father had taught me to do that as a last resort. We had lost a lot of dogs around here to mountain lions and even coyotes. And back in that region, during that time period, they were known to attack people too. It's rare, my dad would say, but they can tell how big you are from your voice more often than not. And a kid like you would be easy pickings. I shuddered at the thought. These days, survival skills might be something different than what my dad taught me. But we were country folk, trying to do our best to live and let live. After about an hour of sitting there, it was completely dark, and I knew by then my parents were probably frustrated or already looking for me. After all, this would be the first time I ever stayed out too late. So I assumed their first thought would be that I got lost, not that I was being disobedient. I continued to stay put. I counted the mushrooms over and over again. Then I tried to count the stars through the bare canopy. And when that got boring, I began to just listen to the sounds around me. The wind blowing through trees, nighttime birds complaining about the cold, unseen nighttime critters crawling over the forest floor. And then there was the hacking sound, a sort of wheezing that echoed through the forest in the distance. That was a sound I was not familiar with, and it made me tremble the closer it got. It was getting closer every time I heard it, and the sound would come again every couple of minutes. I was sure it was a bear with allergies or something, and a bear would be bad news, and it was fall, so a bear would be gorging itself for hibernation the following couple of months. I was beginning to panic again. I tried to slowly rotate myself around the tree, keeping my body hidden on the opposite side of the tree to those noises. For about 10 to 15 minutes, I stopped hearing the noises, and I was beginning to calm down, until... The sound was coming from right behind me. On the other side of the tree, I knew I would find that creature there. A big, nasty, slobbering, and hungry bear. I could see it in my head already. I'd never been more horrified in my life. One wrong move, one wrong sound, and it would all be over for me at just 10 years old. Then again, something about the sound was strange. I had heard and seen bears before, and they'd never made this sound. If it was feeling sick, I mean that sick if it was making those sounds, I felt curious, and I nearly hurled myself when I saw something come out of its throat. I'm sorry if this next part... He saw that pile of bile as well. With a huff, he held my hand and led me back home without a word. I made it home okay. And later that night, after I was scolded for letting myself get lost in the woods, I asked my dad if he had seen that weird animal, and the only thing he would reply, even to this day, was, "Strange things out there. Best be careful next time." That makes me think he knows something that I don't. What was it that I saw? This creature with a wolf's head, human-like teeth in the front, and a broad, muscular back, 3 to 4 times as wide as any canines. I don't think I'll ever know. But after all these decades, I'm still just as curious. Blue Ridge Dogman. From Anonymous. I've never told this story to anyone before. I don't want people to think that I'm crazy. I'm a professional, and if anyone were to link this story to me, it would affect my practice. Despite that risk, I have to tell someone of this experience, even if it's only anonymously. It happened back when I was 10 years old in the summer of 1979. Looking back, I had an ideal childhood, which can be quite rare these days. I'm from the Triad area of North Carolina, in a location that was relatively rural at the time. I was pretty much a free-range kid. So long as I was home for supper, there weren't any problems. Much of my time was spent playing in the woods and creeks within a mile or so of home. Naturally, being a bit of a country boy, I was obsessed with hunting, fishing, guns, bows, and arrows, but especially deer hunting. I read hunting magazines voraciously, soaking up everything I could about the habits of white-tailed deer, from when and where they moved, and what they ate, depending on the time of year. Furthermore, I learned their seasonal diet, and how to read deer signs, from rubs, scrapes, spoor, and finding their trails. The experience I wish to relate here did not occur in North Carolina, but up in Virginia. It is a memory that haunts me yet, and is something I'll never be able to forget. As much as I enjoyed the woods and creeks of my home, my grandmother's place in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia was special. That was wilderness compared to the woods of my home. Her land in Carroll County was on a ridge about 1.5 hours from home. It was just a 3-room cabin then, without year-round running water. When the weather was good enough for the unpaved mountain roads to be drivable, we were there most weekends. I would spend most of the day roaming all across the mountain from the top of the ridge to the river below. The nearest neighbor was about a mile away on a state-maintained gravel road. But even then, most of the homes in that area were vacation homes and were normally empty. It was a Saturday in June, and school was out for the summer. We'd go up Friday evening and come back Saturday night. My grandmother was very devout, and probably the sincerest Christian I've ever known. It was Saturday morning, and I had the entire day to explore the mountain. By this time, I had a fairly decent grasp of the habits of the local deer population. Deer are most active at dawn and dusk, and when under pressure, such as during a heavy hunting season, they will become mostly nocturnal, unless they're in rut. But this was June, and hunting season was months away, and rut was a couple months after that, so I made my plans to explore the creek by following it to the river, then follow the river upstream to the big rock, then hike up the rather steep mountain back to the cabin, stopping for a rest at the shallow cave. Then I would make it back to the cabin about noon for something to eat. Then I'd have to help in my grandmother's garden for a few hours. As you can imagine, that was a busy morning and afternoon. But at 10 years old, there is endless energy, and I had decided to take my binoculars and watch a recently timbered patch of land from the top of the ridge once my chores were done. I set off with a promise to get back just before it got too dark. The only real agriculture in those mountains was raising beef cattle, hay, silage, and some cabbage. The apple orchards were mostly on the southern side of the Blue Ridge, near the tourist areas. Most of what the deer ate around my grandmother's cabin at that time of year would have been tree or perennial browse, and any annuals such as pulkweed and other green leafy plants. They would also obviously eat any berries that were starting to come out around that time. There were a few hours of daylight remaining when I took off up the road with my binoculars and canteen of spring water. The wind had been blowing favorably all day. For those who don't know, while you may fool a deer's eyes, you will not fool his nose. The wind decides pretty much everything when it comes to hunting deer. On this day, the wind was favorable. It was blowing at a crosswind to me when overlooking the cleared little valley. The cleared land went down to the creek and had been timbered the previous winter. It was lush and new growth for the deer to feast upon, but it was still low enough that any adult deer would be visible from my vantage point at the top of the ridge. The other side of the creek remained in timber and thick rhododendron thickets. I got settled in a good couple of hours before dusk. I wanted to be there in plenty of time for the woods to calm down from my walk to my spot, and long before the deer came out. I didn't want to spook any deer on the walk in. As I said, I got settled into my spot and made it as comfortable as I could, and I constructed a rough blind by placing some leafy branches into the ground to break up my outline. This took about 10 minutes. I stretched out and scanned the clear-cut area below me, double-checking the likely areas I expected the deer to come out of the woods into the clearing to browse. Then I just rested, enjoying the pleasant evening, watching birds and small animals. After about an hour and a half, the sun was starting to set, and I took one last drink of water until it got dark. Suddenly, there was a bit of movement down to my right. After scanning the area with the binoculars, I saw that it was a deer and a new fawn. The doe paused at the edge of the clearing to make sure it was safe, while occasionally checking her back trail. It then slowly moved out into the clearing, quickly followed by the fawn. Just one large doe and one fawn, which wasn't a surprise since older does tend to have one fawn, while younger ones more often have two fawns. But the two deer were not alone. Another deer followed them. The three deer slowly worked their way up the creek, eating browse as they did so. The doe would pause to allow her fawn to suckle. It was then that I noticed some movement on the opposing hillside. The rhododendron thicket would move. Something large was slowly working its way down the hillside. That rhododendron thicket was especially thick, and while I couldn't see what was moving through it, its movement caused the thicket itself to move. I assumed it was another deer. By this time, it was close to being dark. The 3 deer had taken about 30 minutes to work their way up the little creek from where they had exited the woods. The deer that I expected to come through the rhododendron thicket had never left the thicket to cross the creek, which led me to believe it was an old buck, since they're usually more cautious. By then it was almost dark. Fortunately, though, my binoculars gathered much more light. The binoculars magnified and made everything brighter. If I were not using the binoculars, I would never have seen what happened next. Often since then, I wish that I did not have them that day, and that I had left earlier, but that wasn't to be. What I saw next has never left me since then. The 3 deer reached the spot close to the last spot that I had seen the movement through the rhododendron thicket. Just a moment after the deer once again checked their back trail, there was a sudden commotion from the rhododendron thicket. It was a large animal. It leapt out of the thicket, clearing the small creek. The doe was taken down in an instant. What appeared to be a large wolf had the doe's throat in its powerful jaws. Astounded, I watched what appeared to be a wolf kill its prey. Besides the fact that there haven't been any wolves in Virginia for about 150 years, I noticed that there was something else wrong. The wolf's proportions appeared all wrong. Its front legs were too long, its upper torso too broad to be that of a king. But then it only became more strange. As the wolf's jaws crushed the windpipe of the doe, I noticed that its front paws were not paws at all. They appeared to be more like hands than paws. Paws which were then holding down the deer in its death rattle. As the wolf-like animal dropped the deer from its jaws, its prey fell to the ground. The creature raised from its crouching position and stood on its hind legs to a height of, I guess, about 7 feet. It looked around, including in my direction. It sniffed the air as it did so. Fortunately, the wind had held steady. I was not downwind from it. I froze in terror. It did not see me. As the light faded, I could tell that the beast was grayish in color. Its fur was thicker around its neck and down its back. Its muzzle was pronounced. Its hind legs were too short in comparison to its front limbs, and while it was muscular, it was not overly so. The beast began tearing into the doe with its teeth. It was then that I decided that a silent retreat was the most sensible thing. All I can say is, I was ever so glad that I had made a decent blind to conceal my retreat, so that I was able to retreat unseen and relatively quietly. It was also fortunate that the beast was distracted by its meal. I returned to my grandmother's cabin under the constant fear of brutal death. I'd never been happier to leave my grandmother's cabin when the time came. That was the last time I ever went there. My grandmother was not one to walk far from the cabin. I attempted to dissuade her from going there as much. Her health began failing her not long afterward, and her trips became less frequent as the years passed. We sold the land and cabin after my grandmother passed. It was only a few years ago that I learned what I witnessed that evening was a dogman. The beast had been active prior to dusk, and I don't believe that a person can turn into a beast. That is my story. I don't know if the dogman I saw, or one of its kind, still roam those hills, but if you're ever in Carroll County, Virginia, be careful. Bayou Wolf, from Cryptid Lover. I live with my brother while attending an 8-year community college. I walk home from college, but get driven to college in the mornings because my brother works night shift at a vet clinic as a guard. It was December 12th of 2018. I was walking home from college around 7:40. It was finals week and the last day of the fall semester. It started snowing around 5 a.m., so by then the ground was covered in white snow. I took my usual route by the bayou and through the woods for half a mile to get home. The sun was starting to set while I was listening to music on my playlist. I began heading towards the woods. As I get about an eighth of my way into the woods, I hear this low growling sound. We did have coyotes around these parts, so that's what I assumed it was. It begins to get closer, and I realize how much it sounds like a wolf. I stop and try to stand my ground, because running from a predator like that seemed like a really bad idea. Then I hear something behind me as well. I'm freaking out now. No way it could be wolves, I think to myself. But it sounds like a whole pack of them. Just my luck. Something emerges from the woods and lets out a deep, bone-chilling howl. But a wolf it was not. Whatever this was standing 7 to 8 feet tall and had dark black fur covering its body. And its eyes were an icy blue and looked more human. Even its arms and torso looked very human-like, but its legs and head were more like a wolf. My mind begins to race as to what this thing is and what it was. It dropped on all fours and lunged out at me, or at least I thought it did. Instead, it lunges at the bushes. When I look over, there's another one, and both of these things are going at it, attacking each other. I was fascinated, but horrified. They were focused on each other, so I took the opportunity to attempt an escape. But my plan failed, and I'm still not sure what happened. Something just hit me, and I blacked out. What I remember next is a woman shouting at me, asking me if I'm okay. I was apparently covered in blood and dirt. My clothes were torn and my back was burning. The woman helped me up and helped me to her car. She drove me to the hospital. On the way there, I noticed my arm was throbbing. When we made it to the hospital, I was taken to a room. The apparent claw marks on my back were disinfected and stitched up, and an x-ray after that told me that my right arm was broken, so they put it in a cast. I was soon discharged, and my brother picked me up. All in all, for an animal attack, I'd say my injuries were pretty minor. This happened about 1 year and 5 months ago as of writing this. I'm okay now, and I don't walk that way after dark anymore. I've moved to the US this summer and resumed college. I still take walks at night, and I do definitely believe that something exists out there. Something that resembles the werewolves on TV. Luckily for me, I have never seen one since. Just stay safe and follow your gut. This is our life here. From Armored Pigeon. This is the first time I've told this story in a manner like this. Now, I'm not a native English speaker or writer. I live in Brazil, and my family do not have anything extraordinary about them. My dad's an engineer and my mother is a psychologist. I'm 30 now, but this story occurred when I was maybe 10 or 11, sometime in that gap. It was the period